Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining with me as we continue to reflect on the amazing letter of 1 John. Today, we're going to finish with the first chapter as we reflect on verses 5 to 10. So let's listen to them now. This is the message we have heard from him and proclaim to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in the darkness, we lie, and we do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sin and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. If we say we have not sinned, we make him to be a liar, and the word is not in us. Wow, really powerful, isn't it? There's a number of important points to pick up in this passage. The message is the first point we need to pick up on. This was referred to in verse 3. It is a message that is attested to by the eyewitnesses and by God themselves. It is a message about God. Part of the problem with describing God, or even explaining God, is this: how on earth do you describe that which is indescribable, beyond our comprehension? This is why writers such as John use images, as we see here in this letter. God is light. This does not mean that light is God. In other words, the statement is not convertible. What this means is the light is not God, just that God is light, revealing the true nature of everything. It is saying that the light and God are synonymous, and therefore God and darkness are not synonymous. Here, John is picking up on the Genesis 1 themes, where there is chaos and darkness, and God says, "Let there be light," and there was light. The light reveals what is there, what is already there. Light shows us the way. It reveals stumbling blocks. Nothing that is in the light can be hidden. In the prologue of the fourth Gospel, John continues this exposition of the light theme by claiming that Jesus is the light. In other words, Jesus has been revealed by the light of God. And here John is keeping true to the Trinitarian understanding, or at least the fledgling Trinitarian understanding of the three persons in one. And we'll get to that a little bit later in the letter. Do you recall last week when I spoke about fellowship as communion, as mutual indwelling? Well, the same principle applies here, and in fact is developed further by John. There is an important correlation between whether we walk in darkness or we walk in light. Walking is about how we live our life. Do we live our life according to the plan of God? Or do we live our life to the plan of the world or our own plan? Living our life in the plan of God is walking in the light. Living our life in any other way is walking in the darkness. And therefore we cannot have mutual indwelling with one another or with God. What is living our life according to God's plan? Well, frustratingly, John does not go into great details here about what walking in the light or darkness looks like. We can get some glimpses a little bit further on in the letter shortly. However, for now, we don't have anything directly to remind ourselves, and so we have to go looking elsewhere. I will always think of, in these situations, somewhere like the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 to 6. We can also look at Galatians, which is another reason I want to explore that letter after we have explored this fantastic one. In Galatians 5:16 and verses following, walking in the darkness can be equated to things like sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgy, and things like that. Please note that this is not a list of descending order, or even a full list, for Paul concludes his list by saying, and things like that. We might add other things to the list: gossip, slander, false witness, and other such attitudes. So if we are jealous or envious or have enmity towards one another, rivalries, etc., we can be said to be walking in the darkness or not walking in the light of God. And we lie and do not practice the truth. And therefore, even if we go to Holy Communion, we're actually not really in communion with one another. We're actually living our lives as a lie. Paul lists the fruits of the Spirit, which is walking in the light, in the same passage, in Galatians 5, as love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. This is what walking in the light is all about, what communion with God and with one another is all about. And the corollary is, if we're not exhibiting these in our faith communities, we're walking in the darkness. We are not in true communion with one another or even with God, even if we're exhibiting some, but not all of the spiritual gifts. However, I usually find that those who seem to be good or patient or joyful and are still gossiping and slandering, envious and the like, such people exhibiting or seeming to exhibit the fruit of the Spirit are exhibiting a shallow shadow of what Paul is really talking about when they are actually being joyful or good or other things. It's usually, how can I say this? It's usually conditional, whereas what Paul is talking about in Galatians 5 is unconditional. This is a tremendous challenge to us as communities of faith and as individual Christian men and women. We are called, in effect, to be honest with ourselves and honest with God in our relationship with God and with one another. Because God is light and in him there is no darkness at all, we cannot deceive God. We might be able to deceive one another, but we are kidding ourselves if we think that we can deceive God. When we think on this great truth, then the only response is, oh, woe is us, because none of us are walking according to the light. But John says to us, that's okay. The death of Jesus on the cross is what removes the guilt of walking our lives according to our plan and not God's. And it also removes the penalty for living our lives the way we want to and not the way God wants us to. What John is saying to us is simple. It's the person who deliberately and maliciously walks a path different to God's path, while claiming to be walking the path of God, who comes under judgment, who is really not in communion. John will later would say about people who left the community. Actually, they left us not because we forced them out, because they were actually never really part of our community. It never fails to amaze me how many people in the church I encounter who smile at you, say the right things, and then behind your back act in vicious and malicious ways, who gossip and slander and spread rumours and are mean-spirited. This is what John is talking about, the person who is unreflective on their behaviour. And guess what? People outside the church are alert to this. They have what I call the BS detectors up. People who are saying one thing and doing another. What Elijah said when he was talking on Mount Carmel when he was challenging the prophets of Baal and the people of God and saying, you're going after Baal, but you're like a person who is walking with one leg shorter than the other. You sort of limp along. And people can see that, and people can detect it. They might not know why we're limping along, but they can see that something is not right, and they stay away. This is why John goes on to say, if we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and others, actually, and the truth is not in us. Here, while we might think of sin in specifics, sin is really about missing the mark, failing to do what we're called to do. It's much more nuanced than just simply doing something specific. I think John might be thinking here of the Sermon on the Mount, especially in chapter 5, when he reminds the disciples about anger and lust. He says, you have heard it said of old, you shall not murder. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with their sister or brother will be liable to judgment. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. Wow, that's pretty damning, isn't it? Jesus is saying, just because you haven't murdered somebody doesn't mean that you're guiltless. He goes on to say, you have heard it said of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, anyone who looks on another person with lustful intent has already committed adultery in their heart. In other words, just because you haven't done something obvious doesn't mean that you are guiltless. Because God is light. God reveals everything. Only the person who is truly reflective on their behaviour realises their shortcomings or their missing of the mark in their Christian life, and as such are willing to confess this shortcoming or failure, and thus is being honest with God and also with themselves. Also with the wider community. You don't have to go out and blab it all out, but you do have to be honest with God and be honest with yourself. And the great reality is this: when we confess, we are made clean and new, and we are made right before God. If we don't confess, I'm always reminded of the Book of Common Prayer, Confession for Morning and Evening Prayer, where it talks about, because of our sinfulness, there is no health in us. We might look healthy, but we're actually not healthy at all. And only by confessing our sin and being reconciled with God can we be made whole again. What further complicates this is two realities. First is that we are so comfortable with our sin, we are hesitant to confess. And the second is that we are so comfortable with our sin, we fail to see what we're doing or that we're doing anything wrong in the first place. So here John is inviting us to walk in the right path with God. We are only able to do so when we are being honest with God and ourselves and reflect on our behaviour honestly. We will always fall short or miss the mark, but that does not mean that we are cut off from God. Rather, that we are able to be restored by God through his Son Jesus and his death on the cross. Such a person, even when they fail, will be walking or living their life in the light of God, because God is light, and allowing that light of God to reveal the dark places in our lives and the shadows, to bring us to the light and to correct us. The one, on the other hand, who refuses to live this way, even if they claim to be walking in the light, that person is a liar and a deceiver, and the truth is not in them. It seems to me that many such people reside in our churches, just as there are many who are trying to live their lives rightly with God. We need to be aware of both sorts of people and to be encouraged to live and to walk in that honesty of the light of God. And when we detect that people are walking in darkness, we need to be encouraging of such people to walk in the light. However, if they refuse, then there are consequences which John goes into later. So can I encourage each of us to be honest in our relationship with God and to truly walk in the light. The Lord be with you.